what we need now is silent, sensible people who could build things up. That's what we need today in the United States. The charisma types are just of no use to anybody. And so the more we can get of people who have expertise and who are not forced to do a dual war, fending off the press and dealing with hysterical opponents, that person is great because they know how to make great appointments in various kinds of positions.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. I welcome Professor Richard Epstein, a senior research fellow at the Civitas Institute. He teaches law at NYU and the University of Chicago, writing most recently for Civitas Outlook about the skinny budget, the federal skinny budget. Therein lies an irony. Richard, a very good evening to you. The skinny budget, where did that come from? It sounds strange when you talk about a pile of paper. Good evening to you.
Well, a pile of paper which is 6 inches thick. The term comes from a situation whereby this is a preliminary document and they don't give each line item of the budget. What they tend to do is to lump everything together in large categories. And it's designed to give a signal to the rest of the world what their priorities are, so that when you get the fatter budget down the road, you will not be surprised about its content. It's only a presidential proposal, and he's duty-bound under law to give it. But it's something which is going to meet a lot of resistance from both sides of the aisle on all sorts of issues. So I think the first thing to talk about the skinny budget is the things that are not going to be touched or done. I don't know of anybody who believes that the major systems that we have, the Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, are simply beyond reform as a matter of rational institutional organization, but they're off the table with respect to the skinny budget. And these things occupy a huge portion of the overall budget, so that you cannot, if you leave these things untouched and unreorganized, get yourself into a situation where there's going to be a major reduction in federal spending, which will in fact try to put more money back in the private sector and more money back to the states. The other thing in the skinny budget, which is not so skinny, is the military budget. On this issue, Trump is sort of waffling one way or another. His foreign policy thus far has been relatively non-aggressive, particularly with respect to Iran and Russia, and even China. But the budget calls for a 13% increase, which is real money, but not enough real money. My view about this is that Trump is right at the abstract level when he says that what you need is peace through strength. And it turns out he's basically doing peace through accommodations of one kind or another. And so the rhetoric doesn't match the performance on the ground. And I would be one who would say, I don't think that increase in the budget is enough. I think it has to be much greater. And I think it has to be accompanied with a real reorganization and set of priorities in the military. I cannot think of anybody less able to do that than Pete Hegseth. He's quote unquote a warrior, a term that we all like these days, but he has no managerial skills whatsoever. There are fights that are going to break out under his watch. And the idea that you could even keep the current ship afloat in its current form is, I think, a fantasy with him in charge of it. And the idea that you can use him as an agent of change for the long-term operation of that situation, I think is something foolish. On the positive side, one of the things that I think Trump is quite good about is his relentless chasing after the energy and environmental policies of the Biden administration. I regard those as amongst the worst in history, because what they do is they force you into technologies that cannot survive, and they refuse to acknowledge the enormous advantages that could be made by using such things as hybrid vehicles on the one hand and improved fracking on the other hand. And we're trying essentially to force feed this country into an electronic vehicle future, which is utterly unsustainable for a whole variety of reasons. And I think Trump himself has gotten rid of some of that stuff. And what's interesting about it is when it goes and gets weakened, there isn't any huge hullabaloo or protest about it, because I think most Americans realize that the price at the pump is a real figure and that energy is what drives everything that we start to do. So I think he's doing fine on that. I think it's already had probably a positive contribution to the budget, which may account for the fact why the tariff wars, which I regard as the height of foolishness, did not lead to that much of a reduction in wealth. I also think that Trump is good on another thing. I don't think he's trying to force sectional rivalries in the United States. The great advantage that the United States have is it's a huge common market. And so long as we have the legal doctrines that keep it relatively open, and the willingness of companies to invest around the country without worrying about whether or not they have to give compensation to Illinois when they move to Tennessee and so forth, we will improve on that particular ration. The bad points on this budget? Well, you start with what he wants to do with medical research. He's announced already that he wants to cut out all of the DEI kind of research, but nobody knows what that is. And I quoted a list from that I received from a friend of mine at Johns Hopkins, forbidden terms in grant application. And it turns out you can't study anything that's serious, because if you do, you're going to study poor people and they have health issues, have access to wealth issues, and a lot of other things. You're not allowed to talk about them, even from a conservative side. So what's happening is there are now two things that are going on, I think. My view is there's an attack on the universities from the left through Hamas and through many of its supporters who are resentful of eminence and distinction and want to take the universities down. And there's now an attack on the right by Trump and other people who regard these things as vessels for the most anti-Semitic behavior you could imagine. And they want to take it down. And in the middle, they turn out to be the universities. And what this double pressure has done is it has made it impossible for them to do anything to reform themselves. And Lord knows they do need reform. One of the hardest things to do today is to defend universities from foreign takeovers by the government of one kind or another, and still recognize the enormous mistakes that have been made in the administration of every major university in the United States going through to the beginning of this year. I think there's an effort to try and claw back some of the power, a better set of president's teams and so forth. But the faculties are so contaminated, so utterly one-sided, that this is a long, heroic task. And I don't think Trump is making it any better, but I do think he could make it worse. So to basically relate it to some current events, it's pretty clear to me that the Trump administration must back up the universities and indeed take the cases over from them with respect to the horrible riots that you start seeing on Columbia and Brooklyn College. These are people breaking criminal laws. They're basically violating their terms of their visas. And it's not just the universities who have to take after him. What Trump has to do is to remove them. And once he removes them, he has a lot less reason to going after them for their inability to deal with these things. This is primarily an enforcement project, and he has to take the lead. I assume I've not heard a word from Alvin Bragg, perhaps the worst district attorney at the state level in history. I haven't heard anything from him, but he has to step up as well. So, I mean, we are living in very difficult times, and the budget is a reflection of all that is going on in this particular area. And I would just hope that people would get their priorities straight. This country cannot survive unless we have huge support for basic research in the natural sciences and so forth. It cannot survive unless we can revitalize our sort of common culture on humanities, having to do with humanities and the social sciences. And what happens is what Trump does is he gives, with his extreme statements, covers to people on the left like AOC and Bernie Sanders, who are pushing the same old line that they pushed before. And if they're successful, essentially what will happen is great universities will crumble under the pressure from uninformed individuals on the left and on the right.
Professor, I want to speak to two aspects of the budget. Defense. If you want peace, prepare for war. That's as old as we are. That's even older than we are, Richard.
Oh, yes, but us two graybeards know this full well.
All right. The campaign talked of $1 trillion. The budget comes in, the preparation comes in $100 billion short. I understand there's a reconciliation package, but defense needs everything. We're not facing one, but two very devoted adversaries in Moscow and Beijing. And this
small aids. I agreed with you, as I said. I think this is double the budget.
The second matter has to do with energy. The programs that the Biden administration inheriting from the Obama administration intention are green after green after green of virtue signaling, all of which come to nothing. Remember Solyndra? We've got a new one out west. I don't even know the name of it. It's a solar farm that opened for some big number, now closing. And then there are all the subsidy programs that were passed.
Well, I think Trump is trying to cut every subsidy for all the solar energy and wind energy out.
I understand.
I mean, look, if you go along the East Coast and ask people what they think about these windmills when they start to blow up, because they're basically built to construction specifications that are not sustainable in an effort to dredge out enough power so they can make a difference on the land, It's utterly suicidal. I mean, one of the things that's very clear is whatever I say about Trump, and I have a lot of criticism of him, the legacy of Joe Biden, the more you look at it, the worse it is. He may have been the most incompetent president in history.
The culture matters I set aside, and I go to you're talking about academia and education and science. I get Science and Nature magazine every week. The editorial page has moved into the news reporting, has moved into every opinion in there is that science is the victim of anti-intellectualism in America. Can you comment on that, Professor? Is that something that I believe Richard Hofstadter's book was famous for making that declaration that we're a bunch of yahoos and we don't appreciate our betters. Is that accurate?
No, I don't think it's accurate. I think it's accurate of the visible part. One of the things I did about 2 or 3 years ago is I went back and I reread the Hofstadter book. It's a terrible book. I mean, I love the title, but if you start looking at it, it's a series of rants that take place against individuals at his time in the late 50s and the early 60s. It is not a book of a constructive program of how it is that you organize anything. It's a diatribe against its critics. And we don't need that now. What we need now is silent, sensible people who could build things up. You know, my idea of an intellectual hero, I'll bring back a name from the past, is Clark Kerr. Do you remember who Clark Kerr was?
No, I don't.
Well, Clark Kerr was a guy who wore seersucker suits. He had the personality of a wet eel. And what he did is he made Berkeley into one of the great scientific centers in the face of the globe. And what he was able to do is to recruit first-rate people in first-rate departments, back them up, and he was doing just fine running the place until we had all the free speech stuff in the early 1960s. And you could not imagine a man ill-suited for dealing with Mario Savio and company. And he was eventually kind of between age, was kind of forced out of the whole operation. But people like that are the kinds of guys who make a nation great. You do not make people great in the sciences by essentially thundering this, that, or the other thing about its social mission and so forth. What it is a quiet accretion of experts, giving them the right directions, picking the right projects in one way or another. I was pretty good friends with my friend Dan Tostenson. You know, he was also, you know, a very boring man if you listen to him talk. And then on the other hand, you start to look at what he was able to build up high of Harvard science. You know, this guy made really big bets like on nanotechnology and so forth, and got the right people to sort of fill them up. That's what we need today in the United States. The charisma types are just of no use to anybody. And so the more we can get of people who have expertise and who are not forced to do a dual war, fending off the press and dealing with hysterical opponents so that they essentially have to have an out-facing role, which is inconsistent with their ability to be a master of the kinds of things they do. What you need to do when you have a great president of a university is that person is great because they know how to make great appointments in various kinds of positions. And you remember, I've always told you what people ask me about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the same issue. I could not imagine somebody who is less informed on figuring out how to run the New Deal. He was a cartel maker. When it came to the war, his ability to figure out who the world he was going to appoint to what position and why seems to have been unrivaled by anybody else. The last little story I read about that is he makes George Catlett Marshall Secretary of State, the head of everything else, right? You know, he was 139th on the list of officers in the military when he did this. He picked Eisenhower out of nowhere. Alfred Loomis, you know, Oppenheimer, Vannevar Bush. That was the strength. And it's widely underestimated how important the appointments process is in trying to run an institution. When I'm thinking about candidates for presidencies or deans or whatever it is, that to me is the number one criterion you worry about. You can't do everything yourself. You got to get the right people to do it with you and for you.
Last thing, Professor, because we have to speak to anti-Semitism. The skinny budget is inadequate because it does not confront what's sinking us, which is the entitlements. Until that's done, no budget is going to answer. Do you agree?
That's what I said at the beginning. If you recall, my first sentence was, if you keep Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid out from underneath the reconciliation process,
Right.
you're not going to succeed on the budgetary side, period. And what's worse about that, you'll become inflationary, And then if you're Trump, you want to impose the tariffs. That means that you want cheap money from the Fed, which is not at this point obliging, which means you're going to go back to the cycle of inflation that you otherwise have.
Professor, we must move on.
All
Professor,
right, I love to.
we've skinny budget, not adequate. There are details here, but not adequate. We move to anti-Semitism in America. Anti-Semitism in New York. The number 80 arrested at Columbia University in protest, in deliberate provocation, having to do with chanting directed against anyone, randomly, but especially to undermine an event being held at one of Columbia's prestigious theaters. Now, that was joined by an event at Brooklyn College, many more arrests. The reason I mention this, Richard, is we've been speaking of the Harvard report, which reflects upon 2024. It's here right now. It's all around us in New York. Anti-Semitism. Where is it coming from, Richard? Who is driving this? What is driving this?
Well, I mean, this is absolutely a trillion-dollar question. Hamas has engaged in many wars before, as recently as 6 or 7 years ago, and there was not a peep of any of this. The moment this starts to take place on October 7th, on October 8th, there's a complete breakdown of social norms. When the people who purported to represent 30 organizations at Harvard announced that Israel was entirely responsible. It wasn't even Israel, the Israeli entity, for all the violence that took place in Hama.
Grotesque falsehood, grotesque.
Yes, but what happens is the response was pathetic. You have to have enough moral courage when your institution is under attack from internal people to say that they're wrong.
Right, 1,000 pages Harvard report. What did they not see? What don't they see, Richard?
What I don't think they understand is how endemic the general culture is in fostering this stuff. And, I haven't read this thing in any detail, but if you start looking back at Harvard, the leftward tilt in that institution, which is taking place over the last 10 or 15 years, is essentially the precursor of everything that starts to go on. Because what happens is it now becomes comfortable to silence people whom you don't like. It becomes comfortable to have weird sorts of speech codes about, well, you have to use the right gender pronouns and all the rest of this stuff. And what happens is if you start having that kind of things, the people who realize that you can push people down, then are going to try to galvanize around a cause. And there were two causes they did in rough sequence, the Black Lives Matter stuff. And, if you try to answer that by saying all lives matter, you became a bigot. And that set the tone of intolerance, which then got transferred to the Israeli situation. And the common theme between the both of them on the intellectual side is that these are deeply colonial type of movements and that high-minded people have to wreck them down and destroy them. And that was exactly the language that was used with respect to Hamas. So I think, in effect, that that's the key element. That's the intellectual side, but there's got to be a financial side. Somebody has to be supporting these people in what it is that they're doing and defending them and giving some kind of aid. I don't know whether there are domestic groups in America, whether there are foreign groups in America. You and I have both noted that there are very substantial funds of money coming into places like the University of Pennsylvania from Abu Dhabi and Saudi Arabia and so forth. And the basic rule that you have is with money comes, strings come attached to it. We don't know what these strings are or how strong they are. But what I think that they have done is, to some extent, to mobilize the ability of universities to treat this kind of anti-Semitism with the United Front.
All right, quickly, Columbia University, first-rate outfit, very first-rate. And they've made adjustments since the events of 20. Yes. Still, they were hit, Richard.
That's why they were hit, John. Precisely because they did make the adjustment. And these guys are out to kill them. And so what happens is Columbia has to be much more forceful, but more importantly, Mr. Rubio has to take over. You cannot leave this as strictly a state matter. You'll get Mr. Bragg running everything into the ground. And you can't leave it to Columbia because they don't have police power. So it's the federal government has to take over. And the way they should take over is basically to say, look, we understand what's going on now. We're going after these people. And we know that you're now in good faith. So what they have to do to make this really work is to restore the funding to the scientific programs at Columbia, forget the threats about decrediting them and so forth. They have to build up the legitimate part of them instead of treating everybody at Columbia as though it was still the year 2024. And this is terrible blindness on the part of the Trump administration if they don't, for heaven's sake, blackball. they always refer to events long gone to justify current restrictions that are unjustifiable.
Professor Richard Epstein, writing at the Civitas Outlook, I'm John Batchelor.